Welcome to the 2022 CARE conference focused on sustainability. My name is Shiva Rajgopal, and I'm the Kester and Byrnes Professor of Accounting and Auditing at Columbia Business School. I have the pleasure of talking to Rakhi Kumar today from Liberty. Rakhi, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to actually do this. I know that you're a busy person. So, before we begin, Rakhi, could you maybe tell us a little bit about your sustainability journey? You've had an illustrious career with State Street before this. How did you happen to come to the area, and what kind of mindset and perspective do you bring so that folks can, place your comments in context?
Thanks, Shiva, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. You're going to have me date myself. So I actually entered the field when it was not a field. I found my passion of ESG when I was in business school, my first and second year of business school, this was in 2000, 2001. And that was when Enron and WorldCom was blowing up while I was at school. And that's when I felt, I'm a chartered accountant, so much like you. I'm an accountant from India, and then I was doing my MBA here in the US, and I just felt my worlds colliding. And I said, this is what I want to do. Naively, I thought that every investor would want a person like me who understood accounting, business, and governance. It took me about 10 to 12 years after I graduated to land up at an investment shop. In the interim, I worked at Moody's, helping them with governance. Then, and as they were setting up their practice, and then I also worked at the Institute of International Finance, doing a policy think tank, doing corporate governance of emerging markets. I covered 12 markets for them, and then also worked post-financial crisis. That's the 2008 crisis, and on issues with them. And then I landed up at Liberty, where for 9 years, I was at the end heading up the asset stewardship as well as ESG investment part of the business. And then now I'm at Liberty Mutual, an insurance company, and I've been here for 3 years and I'm loving it.
Well, thank you so much. That's quite a journey. If I had more time, I would have asked you, what's the end round of climate, but maybe it's already happened. So let's dive right into it. So I've been poking around the area for a bit, and I'm teaching a class on, climate risk modeling later in the fall. And, one of the things that jumps out at me is, if there's any industry that should be all over this, it should probably be the property and casualty insurers, because it hits their pocketbook. But at least in the US, unlike Europe, and maybe that's driven more by regulation, but at least in the US, by and large, maybe, present company excluded, the P&C industry has been rather quiet about the whole climate change problem, to the point where somebody might argue that they're missing in action. Would you have reactions on why that was, and is that likely to change?
Yeah, so Shiva, I can understand why you may have that perspective. And I would say if I were not in insurance, I would probably have that similar perspective. But we did have our Enron moment. And that was 30 years ago in August of 1992 when Andrew, Hurricane 5 category hurricane, hit the Miami-Dade area. That changed it for the P&C industry. It really started the conversation on resiliency, building codes, and also what we use today, catastrophe models, financial models that allow us to really understand and price for the financial or physical risk from catastrophe events or catastrophic events. So I would say that the insurance industry was the first to address climate change because we price it. I think where your comment may resonate a little bit is what's new to the industry is the transition risk, right? So it's climate transition risk. So unlike other aspects of the financial sector, we think of physical risk very differently than we think of financial risk because we take on physical risk and we're part of the solution. And when it comes to transition risk, it's about how is the world transitioning to a low carbon economy, and how is that going to impact the insurance business or the role of insurance in that in supporting that transition. And I would say two things here. One, it's very relevant for the industry, but probably we're later to the game is because most of our coverage tends to be a 1-year coverage. So as a transition risk, we can really transition if we want to, if we decide to. And the second bit is a lot of the tools that were built for transition or to address transition in financial services were built for banks and financial and asset management firms, and they may not be fit for purpose for insurance because our focus is not on mitigating all kinds of climate risk, because mitigating means we're not doing our business. And frankly, if insurance is not available, that risk doesn't go away. It still exists. And now it's the average individual or the taxpayer or the government really left holding the bag. So I think we think about climate risk very differently within the industry.
So, your story just reminded me of a topic that I find particularly difficult to teach, the area of scenario analysis. It's all over the place. So many NGOs pushing their own framework and regulators. So I noticed that Liberty did something different compared to the other financial companies. Would you like to comment on Liberty's unique approach to scenario analysis?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Shiva. So I chair Liberty's Climate Council. This is a small group we've put together of people from across the functions and businesses at Liberty that meets once every other week to really think about climate issues. And we were around this time last year, right after Labor Day, we were starting to think about what should we do from a scenario analysis. And we looked around what others were doing, particularly in Europe or in the other parts of the financial business. And what people were doing, or what everybody does, is you take your portfolio, whatever portfolio you're trying to stress test, and use a transition model to stress test it over 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 extra, 50 years out, and then make a decision. And we sat back and we said, you know what? That's like asking somebody in 1970 to use a model that's going to predict what the world's going to look like in 2000 and 2020 and make a portfolio decision. That sounds ludicrous, but that's exactly what a lot of companies are doing right now. So one of the things we decided to do was really do two different types of exercises. The first one was take our investment portfolio and actually stress test it, but only using the 5, 10, 15-year period, because realistically outside of that, any kind of transition plan is based on science fiction or wishful thinking. And then we unpacked these models, and we used the NGFS, the Network for Greening of the Financial System. These are models built particularly for the financial sector, used by a lot of the federal government or government's treasuries or reserve banks across the world. And we unpacked those models to really understand what are these models really telling us from a horizon scanning perspective. So that's really the and the third thing we did was we actually tried to understand these models. How reliable are these models? How good are these models? What can they do? How should we use this information in our decision making? So I would say at a high level, that's what we did.
So you mentioned macro and portfolio perspectives. Would you mind unpacking a little bit in terms of what did you learn as a company?
Yeah, sure. Very interesting. So when we look at the horizon scanning exercise, and for us, it was, there were 2 or 3 core insights. The first one being, we should not expect common policy action globally, right? And the reason is, if you think about it, EU has made a commitment to transition to net zero in a 2050 time horizon, China 2060, India 2070 with caveats, which means the world and different geographies are going to have different policy time horizons. So for a global company, that's going to be challenging. The second one is the common thinking is you need common action. What our research showed us that it's actually coordination that is needed to reduce the economic impact of the transition rather than common action. And the recent Inflation Reduction Act that was signed, if you juxtapose that with the EU Green Deal, you can see what we mean by common coordination, not common action. We can go into that a little later. The other thing we saw in the models was that the shape of policy is going to be determined by your economy, the dependency on energy, and your carbon intensity of your economy. And I know this sounds like, of course, after the Ukraine war, but all this research was done at the end of last year, and the Ukraine war just has brought to light some of what the models were already telling us, but we were missing because we were doing this portfolio level assessment. And then the last one is that as a company, we should actually expect a disorderly transition. Everybody is going to be moving at different times. For company-specific risk, so now that was macro, from a company perspective, the TCFD describes transition risk stemming from 3 to 4 sources. One is policy and reputational risk. The second one is technology. And the third is market change. And the models show you that it's the imminent change, or the risk is that companies need to manage is policy change. The models don't show any immediate disruption or transition disruption from a technology perspective, but technology certainly is an opportunity aspect that you need to lean into. And then the last one is market change. There are 2 parts of market change. One, policy change results in market change, but there's a part of market change which requires human behavior change that is very hard to model and predict. So, for example, whether you and I are going to start keeping our thermostats at a higher, temperature than we're used to in the summer, and and be more uncomfortable in the winter, that is going to help us reach net zero. So that's a lot of stuff we need to think about.
The other aspect of scenario analysis that I found tough as I was putting my class slides together was the quality of the data. Both the absence of granular data and, big holes in the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. So I'm wondering if you came across similar challenges, and would you have thoughts to share that maybe both companies and academia can learn from?
Absolutely. You're spot on with regards to the data. And I would say we've been talking a lot about data, but we should also talk about quality of models. So let me go into the data aspect first. So we at Liberty have been looking at integrating ESG into our underwriting process. We are very constantly looking for data. And just one of the assessments that we did is that a lot of the data is available for publicly listed companies. We support the economy, which includes a lot of private companies, small companies, etc. We could probably cover only about 25 to 30% tops of our portfolio to get information on emissions, for example, from an insurance perspective. There's a huge gap. And how are we going to get the information? And then let's forget about the quality. Let's assume the quality of the data is good. The missing data is a problem. But I think even before we get to data, Shiva, we have to think about those models. So let me go back to that model of currently what we're doing using this model to go into 5, 10, 15-year horizon. The models are static. So what most people have done is taken these open source, whether it's IPCC on the physical risk, or they've taken NGFS, and then they've somehow linked it to certain portfolios, and then there's a black box, and you don't know how it's working, what it's working, and it gives you spits out a result. These models are not dynamic. So, for example, we are on a journey to transition our portfolios towards a lower carbon economy. It's not going to happen today, but the results that I'm getting are point in time. So obviously they're going to show me that the longer I wait, the more climate risk that is there to my portfolio. It doesn't allow me to say, okay, in 5 years, my portfolios, I would have adjusted X to, instead of X exposure, I'll have Y exposure. Do I still continue to have? So they're not dynamic enough for you to manage that risk. So here are some real problems. And what we're doing is we're using this information to start making changes. Meanwhile, there are external triggers, which I talked about, policy, technology, market behavior, that we don't take into consideration. And that's why we have a situation where we are today, where we all want to transition, but the realities of supporting an economic and a just transition are making us rethink how we are approaching transition.
Yeah, one of the other things I like about Liberty's approach is that you emphasize both reduction of emissions and adaptation. And and coming from the global south, and this is something you may or may not want to talk about. I think adaptation is probably the only answer. Think about how zero COVID worked out very badly. So maybe we are not going to change. And I love your comment about the disorderly transition. So would you want to touch on that as well? Because that's somewhat different compared to what the others are doing, both the focus on adaptation and reduction. Sorry.
Yeah, Shiva, you've just hit on it. We're talking about mitigating climate risk. And let's just step back and think about how we've approached mitigating climate risk in the financial sector. Oh, get your exposure, stop funding, etc. That doesn't really reduce climate risk, does it? Right? It reduces money, but there's all the money, there's so much private money that's going into it. I have somebody who told me they have an anti-ESG, an individual who actually has an anti-ESG thesis and investment and is making a lot of money because they're funding coal. So we have to be realistic. What does reduce climate change? And so at Liberty, we have this saying which says, like, look, if you want to save one house, you make sure it's built on a plinth above sea level, right? You want to save a community, you build a seawall to prevent that. But you want to change if you want to save the planet, you got to make sure that seawall is actually marsh or a mangrove, which allows the ecology and environment to sustain. But we definitely do need resilient infrastructure to withstand what we already know is going to happen. And we've not spent enough time. So if you really want to mitigate climate risk, it has to be a dual approach of adaptation or resiliency building is very key. And I think that's one of the things that we've seen the Inflation Reduction Act also take into account, which is conservation and also resilient infrastructure, which was the first act signed in the US. So there's a lot that's going on, and it's a two-pronged approach that needs to happen.
So you seem particularly keen on the Inflation Reduction Act. Would you want to unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, first of all, that so it's personally interesting to me because I was in Oxford at a conference, the Sustainable Conference in Oxford in July. And I was just in the audience, and somebody got up and said, what are we going to do about the US? And the answer was, what are we going to do about the US? And then you just focus on Europe. But with the signing of the Inflation Reduction Act, there's what I've come to realize is that there is action, and the US has done it its own way. And that's what, again, the model predicted. It's coordination, not common action. What Europe did was, the way they're addressing almost the same emission reduction target as 55% by 2030, but off a 1990 base. US is a 40% reduction emission target. By I think it's a 2005 base year, so it's a different base year. But the way they've approached it, US has done a market-based solution, tax breaks, pointing you in the direction, not calling good or bad. There's something for everything, including the power sector and supporting the power sector to transition. What Europe did was spend 2 years coming up with the EU taxonomy. They tried to classify every economic activity as good as bad. And they spent an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out if nuclear or gas would be good or bad. And answer is, now it's good. Let's talk about it later. So I think, and then the next phase is going to be asking companies that are either in Europe or operating in Europe or European domiciled or operating in Europe to start disclosing against all their activity against this framework in the SFRD, CSRD. So what you're doing is this indirect push to, and in that much time, there's action happening. So I think that's what I mean. There are two different frameworks now that countries in the world have. One is a taxonomy framework, and I know Singapore started a taxonomy, and Colombia has started its own taxonomy, and it's disclosure-based, indirect. And then you have the US, which is giving you tax breaks and really focused on bringing jobs back in. So there's that estimation that you're going to actually have 1.3 million jobs by 2030, and they want to be net exporters. You're even going to bring back mining, right? So a bad activity we're bringing it back because we want to be net exporters. So there's two different frameworks here now that exist.
There's so many interesting ideas there. Top down, bottom up. Can we get to nirvana through disclosure alone as opposed to economic incentives and the whole, friend shoring, etc. type things in the US? So it's great. We're sadly running out of time. Maybe one final question, if you will. I know this is your, time off, and you've been kind enough to kind of give us some time. What keeps you at night? And I hope you're a sound sleeper, though.
Yeah, I know. I would say that, we are so focused on climate and emission calculation, measurement, reduction. The conversation is moving very quickly to, biodiversity, land use, oceans, and thinking of the environment as an ecosystem. And again, I'm going to go back to the Oxford conference that I was just at, and one of the panelists on the biodiversity conference panel just talked about, said, if you think, climate is, basically biodiversity is so complex that it's going to make climate look easy, right? So a lot is coming our way. The TNFD, the Taskforce on Nature-Based Financial Disclosure, is on its way. And I'm not sure we're prepared because we're still just dealing with climate and carbon emissions. And it may require us to change our entire thinking. And we've built so much around it. In order for us to really have a good green planet, we just need to make sure we don't choose one good for some and create bad and some unintended consequences. So I have a feeling we're going to have to continuously challenge ourselves and read whatever our thinking today is going to change by day after tomorrow is all I can. And that scares me because we're building.
Yeah, unfortunately, we'll leave it there. But two things. One, I'm going to assign Liberty as my scenario case. And I need to go to that same conferences that you do. What is this Oxford conference? We'll probably talk offline. And then.
It was my first time, and it's great. And it's the Oxford University. They put it up and every July, and I'm going next year too because I really learned so much from it.
Thank you so much, Rakhi. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been really insightful. Thank you very much.